Samantha's eyes snapped open to a harsh, artificial light that splayed across her vision in stark white rays. Disoriented, she lay still for a moment on the cold, tiled floor, the chill seeping through the fabric of her clothes. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, misting in the air as if the place were not just visually cold, but physically so. The humming of fluorescent lights overhead filled the silence, their constant buzz like a swarm of electric bees trapped within the sterile expanse above. She sat up, her movements stiff and uncertain. The eerie glow from the bulbs cast long, ominous shadows across the endless stretch of yellowed walls and threadbare carpet beneath her. Samantha turned her head slowly, taking in the uniformity of the desolate space. Each direction presented an identical view, door after door, each one closed, with no indication of what lay beyond. It was as if she'd been dropped into an M.C. Escher print, reality twisted into an unending labyrinthine puzzle. Her heart thudded against her ribcage, each beat a loud drum in the oppressive quiet. How did I get here? She racked her brain, but her memories were like smoke, slipping through the fingers of her mind. Samantha's muscles tensed as she pushed herself up from the cold, unforgiving floor. Her palms felt the gritty texture of the concrete as she rose, an action fueled by raw determination. The corridor stretched before her, a vein of the backroom's vast, labyrinthine body, lined with doors that promised nothing but further mystery. She started walking, each step deliberate in the eerie silence. The air was thick with dust motes that swirled lazily in the narrow beams of light filtering through the spaces above. They danced like specters, taunting Samantha with their chaotic waltz. She reached out to touch one of the fluorescent tubes overhead, half expecting it to flicker at her intrusion, but it remained indifferent, bathing her in its unchanging glare. Door after door loomed on either side, the pale wood grain and tarnished brass knobs becoming a repeating motif in this surreal gallery. Samantha's fingers curled around the first doorknob she encountered. It didn't budge. She moved to the next, giving it a forceful twist, but it was just as immovable as the first. Each subsequent attempt met with similar futility, reinforcing her sense of isolation. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The unknown lay beyond these barriers, spaces untouched or perhaps inhabited by things best left undiscovered. With every failed entry, the reality of her situation pressed down harder. The halls were not merely corridors, but potential veins of some greater entity, the night, rumored to exist within and all around. It was said to be an abstract presence, more felt than seen. Was this endless expanse a manifestation of its being? Samantha's hand paused mid-reach for another doorknob, her breath hitching. She could almost feel the pulse of something vast and incomprehensible, lying just beneath the surface of the walls, watching her struggle with a detached curiosity. Shaking her head, she dismissed the thought as quickly as it had come. This was no time for fear to take root in her mind. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, pushing forward, driven by a singular goal, to find an exit, to prove that the night was just a myth, and to reclaim the life that felt so distant now. Samantha advanced, her footfalls the sole punctuation in the monotonous hum that saturated the air. The fluorescent lights above cast an unchanging glow, a sickly yellow that painted every surface with the same jaundiced hue. She turned a corner, only to be greeted by a view indistinguishable from the one she'd left behind. The halls were like echoes of each other, repeating into infinity. Her hand trailed along the wall, fingers grazing over the cool, rough texture of concrete bricks. Each corridor seemed a carbon copy, meticulously cloned to disorient and confuse. It was as if the space itself was alive, reshuffling its innards to keep her ensnared. Samantha's heart clenched at the thought, an involuntary tribute to the whispered rumors of the night. A sentient maze, shifting under the guise of stillness. She stopped for a moment, closing her eyes. Was it possible that she was traversing the capillaries of some vast, slumbering organism, that each step brought her deeper into the belly of an enigmatic beast? She quelled the budding hysteria, admonishing herself for entertaining such thoughts. This place, no matter how bizarre, had to have an end, a boundary where reality waited patiently for her return. Opening her eyes, Samantha pressed on, but her sense of direction faltered with the realization that there were no landmarks, no scratches or stains to mark her passage. Time, too, had become an elusive spectre here, slipping through her fingers like water. Had minutes passed since she awoke? Or hours? Days even? The endless drone of the overhead lights offered no answers, only serving to deepen her unease. With each step, her panic escalated, a crescendo of fear that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. The sameness of the corridors was oppressive, a psychological weight that bore down upon her shoulders. Yet, she moved forward, driven by a primal urge to escape, to find a breach in this relentless monotony. Her breaths grew shallow, the air tasting stale and lifeless as she ventured further into the labyrinthine heart of the backrooms where the night might well be lurking, an unseen observer of her plight. Samantha's hands trembled as she brushed the cold, grimy wall for support. Her chest tightened, a knot of dread winding its way around her heart. The reality of her situation unfurled like a dark flower in her mind. She was lost, utterly lost, in a place that defied all logic and hope. Each breath became a silent prayer for deliverance, but the stale air offered no solace, only the taste of despair. "Think, Samantha, think," she murmured to herself, trying to anchor her scattered thoughts. Dr. Lancaster's words about the backrooms echoed in her head, his confident tone now seeming like a cruel joke against the backdrop of her helplessness. He had spoken of it almost clinically, a subject of study, while she lived the nightmare. She stumbled forward, her steps growing erratic as panic clutched at her throat. What if this was the night's doing? A malevolent force shaping itself into corridors and doors, feasting on the fear of those trapped within its walls. She shuddered, pushing away the thought as too hideous to consider. The intersection loomed before her, a six-pronged snare set by an unseen architect. 6 identical paths stretched out, their dim lighting flickering with the pulse of some unknown power. The fluorescent hum seemed to mock her indecision, a ceaseless reminder that she was at the mercy of this place. 6 choices, no signs. Her voice was hardly more than a whisper, a feeble attempt to break the silence that pressed against her eardrums. Which way led to salvation, and which to further torment? Was there a method to this madness, or was it simply a roulette wheel spun by the entity? Just then a soft scuffle reached her ears, a sound alien yet terrifyingly familiar. Footsteps? Her breath hitched, her body freezing as her gaze darted frantically down each passage. The shuffling grew closer, a quiet herald of impending doom. In the dim light, shadows played tricks on her eyes, but the threat felt palpable, a presence weaving through the stillness. "Move, Samantha, you have to move," her mind screamed, but her limbs refused to obey, locked in a macabre tableau of fear. All she could do was stare down the branching paths, each one promising an unknowable fate. And somewhere in the distance, the night watched, patient and eternal, as another soul grappled with the illusion of choice in its endless domain. Samantha's pulse thundered in her ears, a frantic drumbeat urging her to flee. The shuffling grew louder, more insistent, as if the very shadows had gait and breath. She turned, her eyes locking onto the source of her dread, a figure stumbling around the corner. The man, if one could call it that, was a grotesque caricature of humanity. His skin clung to his bones like wet parchment, and his eyes were pits of despair that flared with an unsettling wildness. As he drew nearer, his cracked lips parted, revealing a parched tongue that licked the air before producing only a harrowing wheeze. A primordial terror gripped Samantha, clawing at her senses. This was no benign spectre or lost soul. This was a harbinger of the night, a manifestation of abstract horror that stalked these endless, decaying halls. With no time for thought, her instincts seized control. Muscles tensed, she spun on her heel and dashed down the corridor. The fluorescent lights blurred into streaks above as she sprinted, the creature's footsteps echoing her own in a macabre duet. Ahead, an open door beckoned, a narrow slit of hope in the monotony of yellowed walls. Samantha hurdled debris, her breath ragged, as the distance between her and the creature lessened with every stride. It was relentless, driven by some unfathomable hunger that belonged neither to the living nor the dead. She reached the threshold, the scent of mold and neglect strong in her nostrils. With a burst of desperate strength, she threw herself through the doorway. Her shoulder slammed against the frame, propelling her forward as she twisted to slam the door shut. The creature's fingers, gnarled and trembling, grazed the fabric of her sleeve, an icy brush with the void. The door thudded closed, the sound reverberating through the stagnant air. For a moment, Samantha's heart seemed to stop, the silence as oppressive as the gaze of the night itself. Safe, for now, she leaned against the wood, her chest heaving. The entity on the other side let out a strangled moan, a sound that spoke of eternal wandering and unquenchable longing. Then its presence receded, leaving behind only the hum of the lights and the whisper of her own shallow breaths. Samantha's lungs burned with the effort of drawing breath as she pressed her weight against the door, sealing herself away from the horrors outside. Her eyes, wide with the raw pulse of adrenaline, slowly acclimated to the dimness that enveloped her new sanctuary. The room was narrow, a meager capsule of space within the endless expanse of the backrooms. Above, a single bare bulb swung gently, casting anemic light upon the scene, a flickering beacon in the oppressive gloom. Her gaze swept over the walls, cloaked in wallpaper that curled at the edges like dried leaves. Its once vibrant pattern reduced to a ghostly echo beneath layers of grime and time. In the corner, a bare mattress leaned forlornly against the wall, its fabric stained with the memories of countless others who had sought refuge here, if only for a moment. A shiver crawled up her spine as Samantha's attention snagged on the erratic markings that marred the walls. Etched into the very fibers of the place were the frantic scrawlings of previous occupants, words written with such fervor that they seemed almost to bleed desperation. Phrases looped and overlapped in a tapestry of madness. There is no exit, and we are the forgotten repeated endlessly, as though their authors believed repetition might conjure a doorway from the plaster. Every line, every curve of the letters hammered home the gravity of her situation, sinking its teeth into her already fraying resolve. These were not just warnings, they were epitaphs inscribed by those who had surrendered to this labyrinthine purgatory. And now, Samantha wondered with a hollow ache in her chest, was she destined to become one more echo in the cacophony of lost souls? The whispers of the night seemed to curl around her, invisible yet palpable, a presence that thrived on fear, feeding off the remnants of hope that still dared to flicker within her. It was said that the night was less a creature and more an embodiment of the backrooms itself, a living location that observed through unseen eyes and listened with ears woven into the very walls. With every shuddering breath, Samantha could feel it, the unrelenting gaze of the night, observing her struggle, biding its time. An abstract terror, formless yet suffocating, that watched and waited in the shadows, always just out of sight. But Samantha was not ready to let her story end scrawled upon these walls. She would not be forgotten. Summoning the remnants of her strength, she pushed away from the door, her resolve hardening like steel in the forge of her fear. If there truly was no exit, then she would carve one herself, with every step, every heartbeat, every defiant breath. The night could watch all it wanted, but Samantha would not yield to despair, not yet, not ever. The silence in the decrepit room throbbed like a living pulse, pressing against Samantha's eardrums with an almost tangible force. The single bulb overhead flickered sporadically, its feeble light casting more shadows than illumination across the room's decaying walls. With her breath still ragged from exertion and fear, Samantha tried to make sense of the frenzied etchings that surrounded her. But before she could piece together the fragmented thoughts of those who had come before her, the stifling calm shattered. A scream, sharp and guttural, tore through the corridors of the backrooms, slicing into the room and clawing at Samantha's senses. Instinctively, her hands clamped over her ears, but the sound was already there, inside her mind, reverberating with a primal terror that seemed to shake the very foundation of this place. As suddenly as it had erupted, the shriek died away, leaving a haunting silence that felt even heavier than before. Samantha's hands trembled as she lowered them, the echo of the cry fading into the hum of the fluorescent lights. She wondered if the voice belonged to someone like her, caught in the labyrinthine expanse of the night, or if it was another trick of this place, a reminder of the ever-watchful presence that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The oppressive quiet was broken once more, but this time by something entirely different. From deep within the maze, a child's voice floated to her, frail but clear. "If you go down in the woods today, you're in for a big surprise." The melody was out of place in the grim surroundings, a stark contrast to the scream that still lingered in her memory. Despite the fear knotting in her stomach, Samantha found herself drawn to the voice. It beckoned her with a siren call that promised the innocence of the world outside these yellow-stained walls. Perhaps it was a beacon, a sign of other lost souls navigating the endless monotony of the night. Or perhaps it was another layer of deception in this place that defied all logic. But Samantha couldn't ignore it. She stepped out of the room, the faint song leading her like a lifeline through the identical hallways, each step a fight against the dread that whispered to her of the futility in seeking escape. Every fibre of her being urged caution, but the allure of the child's voice was too potent, a thread of hope in the suffocating embrace of the night. Samantha's breath steadied in her chest, a rhythmic anchor against the relentless thrum of fluorescent lights. She edged forward, each footfall deliberate, a silent incantation for courage as she willed herself toward the spectral melody that wound through the air. The nursery rhyme floated on an unseen current, a fragile thread in the oppressive tapestry of the night. The cramped room, with its peeling wallpaper and cryptic messages, receded into the dimness behind her. Ahead, the corridor stretched, its end swallowed by shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Samantha's eyes darted from corner to corner, half expecting the walls themselves to shift, to rearrange into some new configuration of despair. A movement flickered at the edge of her vision, there, then gone. She froze, her heart a staccato against her ribs. The shambling figure loomed in the distance, a sentinel wrought from the very essence of the night. Its hollow eyes bore into her, a gaze that knew of her every fear, every doubt. It was a manifestation of the abstract terror that the night conjured, a living embodiment of the unseen force that held dominion here. But the singing beckoned, unfaltering even as the figure watched. Samantha's resolve hardened like cooling glass. She would not be cowed by this spectre, this harbinger of the night's enigmatic will. She stepped forward, her pace quickening, driven by the inexplicable need to find the source of that innocent voice. "Teddy bears are having their picnic," the child sang, the words threading through the stale air of the corridor. The song was a lifeline, pulling her deeper into the labyrinth, away from the creature whose presence was as much a warning as it was a threat. Samantha moved past junctions and doorways that promised only more of the same unyielding sameness, her ears tuned to the haunting lilt of the child's voice. Each step felt like a defiance, a rebellion against the very fabric of the night, and the malevolent intelligence that orchestrated this twisted realm. The notion of an exit seemed almost whimsical now, a dream whispered in the dark. Yet still, she pressed onward, through the cool dampness that clung to her skin, through the humbug that sought to erode her sanity. Step by dreadful step, Samantha advanced, fueled by a mixture of desperation and the faintest glimmer of hope, chasing a melody that might well lead her into the waiting embrace of the night. Please like and subscribe. It only takes you a second, but helps us out a lot.